Okay, I just finished a book, The Age of Myth by Michael J. Sullivan. It's as you can see, it's a paperback fantasy, and it's about what you would expect from a paperback fantasy, meaning it's not high art, but it's good escapist fun if you like fantasy series. I think fantasy is one of those genres where either you like it or you don't like it, so I don't want to waste a lot of time here trying to explain the appeal of fantasy. Suffice it to say, this is in the fantasy genre, so if you don't like fantasy, you can give this one a pass. If you do like fantasy, I think this one was quite well written. I picked this up largely based on the cover art. As much as I hate to admit that I'm the type of person who buys a book based on the cover art, well, that's the dirty little secret of book buying, isn't it? Publishers spend a lot of money on the cover art and the design precisely because they know that when you're in a bookstore you have limited time to peruse a book, and it's largely the cover art that, if not the deciding factor in what you will buy, at least something that pulls you in for the initial look. And actually, let me change the camera angle here, because if I'm going to talk about the cover art, I should make sure I'm showing it. This seemed to promise a mystical fantasy type world. I like the nature element going on here. I like the picture of the big mysterious tree, and then the characters at the bottom here, and there's that wolf. I liked the title, The Age of Myth, which again seems to promise a bit of a mystical, fantastical adventure or setting type thing. I didn't go solely off of the cover art. I also flipped through it in the bookstore and noticed that it was quite readable and written in an engaging manner. So I bought it, and then I read it, and then here I am with the review. So, it is, as you know, impossible to find a standalone fantasy book these days. Everything is part of a series. And this one is as well. I don't know if you can see Book 1 of the Legends of the First Empire. Well, at least it's Book 1, right? I should mention, actually, I'm living in Vietnam at the moment. And I'm in Ho Chi Minh City. If you've lived abroad or if you've lived in Asia, you know that it is possible to get English books, especially in the bigger cities like Ho Chi Minh cities. Although it's sometimes difficult to follow a series all the way through. Meaning you can buy books, but there's no guarantee you're going to find all the books in the series, which has been for some years now a frustration of mine trying to read fantasy series. And in fact, I'm going to jump a little bit ahead of myself. I finished this book. I thought, I wouldn't mind continuing on with that series. It was interesting enough. And I went to all the bookstores and I could not find the next book in this series. And I even checked the sites in Vietnam that sell online. So, unfortunately, I'm just going to be stuck with Book 1 here. The good news is, even though this is the first book in the series, there are some self-contained elements within this book. Or, in other words, there are some long-running plot threads, which presumably are going to get resolved in the second, third, fourth, and fifth, and sixth books in this series. 6 books in the series. But there are also a number of plot threads and character arcs that were contained within this book. And in fact, I was relatively impressed. Sorry, I was impressed. Get rid of the relatively. I was impressed by how this book managed to balance both setting up longer plot threads that will be explored throughout the series, presumably, but also having a number of self-contained plot threads within the first book. Right, where was I? Okay, yes, part of a series. And it's frustrating the fact that every fantasy book is part of a series when you live out in Asia, but whatever. At least it was book 1 that I found in the bookstore, and not, book 5. But then when you open this up, you find that this is, that there are actually several series by the same author in the same fantasy world. There's, I don't know how you pronounce this actually, the Ria Revelations and the Ria Chronicles. So it's not actually the first book in the, the first book in this world, but it's this first book in this series, if that makes sense. The author says right in the beginning, though, right in the author's note, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, don't worry if you've not read the other series I've written. This book works as its own entry point into the world. And in fact, it's set as kind of a prequel to the other series. It's set 3,000 years before his other series. And yes, as somebody who was new to this world, I can attest that I had no problems with this book. It works perfectly well as a point of entry. I did wonder as I read this book, I wondered how much of the world building had been previously established in his other books, and how much of it was unique to this book, because there are all these different races and civilizations and cities. And the standard thing, when you're reading a fantasy book, you get introduced to all these different magical creatures and stuff like that. And I did wonder, would these various names and races have meant more to me if I had read the other books first, or not? I don't know. Somebody who's read the previous books will have to answer that question. But certainly in terms of, like, does it work as an entry point? Yeah, it works perfectly fine as an entry point. So this is, in many ways, a standard fantasy novel. But at the same time, there's really no such thing as a standard fantasy novel, isn't it? Is there? So it's not standard in the sense that it doesn't take place in the world of the medieval castles and kings and queens and knights and stuff like that. It takes place more in the primitive age, kind of, I guess, prehistory, or maybe just the dawn of history, where human beings are living in tribes and kind of wood shacks and wood lodges and very primitive outposts on the outskirts of the forest. And I say, well, I don't know. What's standard in fantasy these days? Is that abnormal, or is that relatively standard? I tend to think of standard fantasy as being kind of knights and castles and stuff like that, but I don't read broadly enough to know what's standard. What is standard? But anyways, this setting of human beings just kind of right at the cusp of civilization ties in nicely with the title, The Age of Myth, and the themes here. There are, I think this is true of any fantasy book. At the very beginning, you're introduced to a lot of names and a lot of creatures and a lot of places very quickly. And to a certain extent, that's all part of the fun. And to a certain extent, it's a little bit overwhelming. You know, you're going back and forth to the map. You're like, all right, I'm going to give this a try, but I'm really hoping that this does make sense within a few chapters. This book in particular, it's got 3 plot lines that it's juggling at once, and they do all come together as you read the book. And they come together within this book, so you don't have to wait until the other books in the series before they all come together. They do come together about maybe halfway through this book. But right at the beginning, you've got to learn all these names and different civilizations and how they work. And again, I don't know how much of this is inherited from the previous series that the author has done in these worlds. But there's the kind of prehistoric humans, and there's 2 different tribes. There's kind of one tribe on these barren rocklands, and there's one tribe in the forest. And then there's this other civilization, which is kind of like these superhumans. They're called, I believe, the Frey. They're regarded as gods by the humans, at least at the beginning of the book. But they're not really technically gods. They're kind of like superhumans that live for 3,000 years. Some of them have magical powers, but some of them don't. And they're extremely fast and extremely agile. But they are mortal beings, as we find out right from chapter 1, because one of them gets killed. I'm spoiling things. I'm giving away minor spoilers, but that is right in the first chapter. Although, I'll probably be giving away some spoilers throughout this review, so take that as a spoiler warning. And then chapter 2, we go to the second setting where we're going to the little village on the edges of the forest. And then chapter 3, we go back to the characters we met in chapter 1. And then, where is it? The other civilization gets introduced in chapter 5, I believe. Yes, chapter 5, where we're introduced to the Frey civilization. We had been introduced to the Frey in chapter 1, but chapter 5 we're getting it from their perspective in their home city, and we're getting introduced to all the Frey characters and the rules of Frey civilizations. And some of the Frey have this thing called the art, which is the magical power. Sorry, I'm giving away a lot of plot beats, which I don't mean to do, because there's no point in watching a review in which somebody just rehashes the plot. I guess my point being, there's a lot of information and a lot of new civilizations and worlds and names and places to get your head around in the first few chapters. But then I think, as most fantasy books do, it lays off a bit after that. So once you've... I was initially worried I was going to get overwhelmed, but then it does lay off, and then you do get to spend time just exploring what the author has set up and getting to know these characters better. So, if it all feels a little bit overwhelming at first, don't worry. And it's written in a very readable prose style as well. I've never really been good at dissecting prose and kind of talking about it in analytical terms, why good prose is good prose. But I know it when I see it, and this is very readable, very easy to read prose that flows quite easily. So I guess that's all I'll say about that. Sorry, I'm going to jump back to something I said earlier, but maybe didn't completely complete my thought on, which was the setting of this book. It's humans kind of at the dawn of history, or maybe prehistory, so it's got that mythic quality to it, reflected in the title. And there's a lot of... I think what this book does fairly well is giving a setting about humans kind of on the edge of a mysterious natural world. So the village is kind of right on the edge of the forest, and the forest is deep and mysterious with all this undergrowth. And there's chapters when characters are going through the forest when it talks about, you know, the mist rising or the trees being hidden by mist. It gives a very nice atmosphere for this just kind of mysterious dawn of history type thing where nature is very much a big thing. Descriptions of waterfalls and cascading rivers in the forest, and it's the atmosphere, I think, is all very nicely done. There are also allusions to all sorts of forest creatures, which don't play a major part. Sorry, the animals do play a major part. This isn't one of those books where there are talking animals. So the animals are animals, but there's a wolf who plays a major part. There's a bear in the forest who plays a major part. But in addition to that, we get lots of allusions to the fairies in the forest. We never actually see them. We get allusions to the ghosts in the forest, and again, we never actually see them. But this is very much a world in which either there are a lot of magical creatures in the forest, or it's commonly believed that there are a lot of magical creatures in the forest. Some of it is left a little bit ambiguous as to what is superstition among these primitive humans and what actually is real in the forest. And I don't know if that would become any clearer in the subsequent books or previous series in this world. But it's all got a very nice mystical feel to it, which is what I was hoping to get out of a fantasy book like this, and what I did get out. The characters in this book are interesting. I don't really have a lot to say about it, other than they're relatively well written, they're likable characters, they're easy to follow. There's identifiable character arcs that people go through, so it's all fairly, it's all competent. One of the things I found interesting about this book is that there's this village, and you've got like the main characters, like, you know, Persephone, who's kind of the strong woman who's struggling to follow her character arc, and you've got Wraith, who's like this really strong masculine character with a sword, who comes from like the brutal the brutal plains area, where he had to kind of grow up strong and be a fighter. But also at the village you have a whole bunch of minor characters, which helps to give it more of like an ensemble feel, like kind of an R-town type feel. So you've got like the former slave girl, who's really inventive and good at making stuff. And you've got Moya, the town beauty, who's just kind of teasing all the men. And you've got Padra, the old grumpy woman, and you've got Bryn, the young girl who's training to become the keeper of the ways. And you've got Gifford, who was born as a cripple and can't quite talk properly, but he's really gifted with making stuff. And you've got Cobb, the pig farmer, who's really inept at his guarding duties. And you've got this ensemble cast, so to speak, of quirky village characters who aren't really the main leads, but who are definitely there and who definitely get their share of screen time, so to speak. And it helps to give this a feel like this is a real village. And when danger does come to the village, like it does in the second and third act, then you do feel that this isn't just this isn't just like a faceless village full of anonymous people. You do feel like you care about this village because you've gotten to know all these characters. So you're not only just concerned about the main characters, you're concerned about the fate of the whole village. So I thought that aspect of it was good. There were maybe a couple of characterizations that I thought were slightly missteps. So, for example, there's this girl Suri who's a mystic. She lives out in the forest with the animals, and then she comes into the village to warn of danger, and then she ends up just staying with the villagers. And because she's been raised out in the village her whole life, she doesn't understand any of the way of conversational niceties. So she interprets literally everything people say. And she doesn't realize that sometimes if somebody makes a statement, it's not actually a statement, it's actually a request in disguise or something like that. Or it's, so for example, somebody will say, "Oh, you're still here." And she'll say, but of course I'm still here. Why does everyone keep saying the obvious? And doesn't realize that the statement like "you're still here" is kind of like it's not simply a statement of fact there, it's an invitation to give information about why you're still here. It's, I don't know, if you've ever watched the original Star Trek, it's kind of the same gag they use with Spock, where Spock interprets everything literally, and he's like, "You humans, you're so strange with it," you know, that kind of thing. I'm a big Star Trek fan. I really like the original series and I liked Spock. But for some reason, I don't know, this character Suri, I found her a bit annoying. And I found that gag of her interpreting everything literally and talking about how strange city folk are, or how strange village folk are. I just found the whole thing a little bit annoying. I think you were meant to find it as kind of delightfully quirky, or maybe even, you know, you were meant to kind of admire how, you know, the wisdom of this childlike character, how she kind of cuts through everybody's bullshit and just kind of doesn't play these games. Maybe even admire her directness. But I just found her character a little bit annoying, was constantly going on lectures about how the village folk don't understand anything, or they're all a little bit crazy. And there was maybe a couple other moments like that with some of the other minor characters. There's Rowan, who's a former slave girl. And she's really inquisitive and inventive. And at one point, one of the characters said they had to stop her from putting a needle into her eye. And another character said, "What? Why would you put a needle into your eye?" And I guess she wanted to measure how deep the eye socket was by putting the needle through the eye. And I kind of thought to myself, okay, that's maybe crossing a line here from like delightfully quirky and endearing to kind of like, okay, a little bit psychotic. Like, I don't think that was the author's intention. I think it was going for maybe delightfully quirky. But it came off as like, all right. This character is no longer endearing to me. Now this character is just like a psychopath. I was a little bit worried that little detail crossed the line with this character. Again, I don't think it was meant to. I don't think she's meant to be portrayed as a psychopathic character. I think maybe the author maybe misjudged a delightfully quirky anecdote there as something which maybe didn't convey what he was hoping it would convey. I'm nitpicking here. And I do want to say this to kind of say that not everything hit its mark perfectly, but on the whole, I really like the ensemble cast, and I thought the villagers were interesting. Yeah, there's also several mysteries set up within this book, which are allowed to linger, and which helped keep me turning the pages, to be honest. And I am terrible at not finishing books. Don't finish half the books I start with. But this book kept me turning the pages, and I think it was because I found those mysteries intriguing. And then we get to the end, and we see how those mysteries get resolved, and I'm not sure that I found the payoff to all those mysteries as interesting as I did the mystery itself. And I really can't say any more than that without getting into heavy-duty spoilers. But I trust you all know what I mean, in that the sense that we've all read books where you're kind of hooked on the conflict, or you're hooked on the mystery, and then you get to the end and you're like, oh, that was it. Oh, well, never mind, that wasn't as interesting as I thought it was going to be. Kind of one of those situations. That being said, it wasn't a major letdown. It was just, yeah, there were a couple things. Okay, I'm going to get into some minor spoilers here. The conflict between Persephone and Kuniger, I was slightly disappointed that this turned out to be just Kuniger being very evil and scheming for the sake of being very evil and scheming. I thought, okay, well, if he's just going to be a template comic book villain, then maybe that whole conflict wasn't as interesting as I thought it was. I think it would have been more interesting if he hadn't been just revealed at the end to be kind of so scheming and evil. I mean, it made perfect sense in retrospect from from like in terms of, oh, you're like, okay, well that's why everyone was doing everything, because they were just evil the whole time. So it explained away everything, but it was just kind of a boring resolution. The other thing, it's hinted throughout that Grin the bear is actually more than a bear. And then, and again, I'm getting into heavy-duty spoiler territory here. Then there's a bit of a bait and switch where we do think she's the long-lost daughter. And then it turns out at the end it's just the bear. And that's clever insofar as it goes, because there's a bait and switch there, and we think, oh, okay, it's the long-lost daughter. Oh, no, it's not. And subverting expectations there in a way. But then the end to that whole thing is, oh, it was just a bear all along. And I thought, okay, you know, I appreciate that we did do that misdirecting of expectations, but if it was just a bear all along, then I don't know. Then that why it seemed to be indicated throughout that it was much more powerful than an ordinary bear. I don't know. I guess the fact that, sorry, at this point I'm assuming I'm talking to people who've already read the book, because I've gone into spoilers. I guess the fact that the bear had been getting fed human meat by Mauve explained why the bear was so antisocial and why the bear kept attacking humans, or attacked a few humans. Actually, while I'm getting into all this, Persephone's son, was Persephone's son killed by the bear or not? Because I know by the end of the book we know that Raglan hadn't really been killed by the bear. That was all Kuniger's scheming. But Persephone's son was still killed by the bear, or was that actually Kuniger's scheming as well? That, I guess that's a little bit ambiguous, huh? But there was definitely something up with that bear, because when they were hiding in that cave, then that bear really wanted to try and eat them. And then at the end, the bear emerged to be this horrible human-eating monster. So, okay, yeah. Anyways, what else is there to talk about here? Yeah, the mystical arts of the fray. Be interesting. It would be interesting to follow the series through and see how this works out. I'm always a little bit suspicious of. I like fantasy stories, but I'm of the opinion that whenever you introduce kind of a lot of magical powers or a lot of godlike magical powers, that's trouble for the narrative. And whether it's the good guys who have it or the bad guys. Because it just means the story is going to get really weird and you're going to end up in these corners where it's hard to resolve. I think lots of fantasy stories end up with this problem, and lots of comic books as well, because, you know, comic books are all about these super powered telepaths, which just kind of end up having these really weird stories in the end. This book was definitely toying with that territory. I'm not sure how the series is going to end up at the end of it. But, sorry, I'm going to have to shift my position. I was sitting on my legs, and now my legs have fallen asleep. And again, like I mentioned, unfortunately, it doesn't look like I'm going to be able to follow this series through at the moment. And I think this is one of those books where if you don't keep the momentum going and you don't keep reading it, one of those series where if you don't keep the momentum going, then it's hard to kind of jump back in after a couple of years absence or something like that. Because there's just so many characters and settings and stuff to keep track of in this book that I don't think I could, wait 2 or 3 or 4 years until I'm in a position where I can access the series again. So I'm just gonna have to leave it here and not continue with the rest of the series.